But first, perhaps because Joe Biden's been slipping in the polls, or maybe it's because Elizabeth Warren's Medicare for All plan has a lot of Democrats nervous that she can't win those crucial industrial swing states up north. Whatever the reason, yesterday we learned that former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg is now actively preparing to enter the Democratic presidential primary, starting with a first step in Alabama, because Alabama's deadline is this Friday, and that's the first deadline. A longtime advisor to the billionaire businessman confirmed it to NBC News yesterday, adding that Bloomberg is yet to make a final decision. According to the New York Times, the once three-term mayor has dispatched staffers to Alabama to gather at least 500 signatures that are needed to qualify for the primary deadline there today. Bloomberg and his aides also reached out to several prominent Democrats to share his intentions to enter the presidential race. The 77-year-old, who has donated more than $100 million to congressional and state legislative campaigns, has toyed with the idea of running for president over the past year. But now the stakes are different, his spokesperson says, saying that Bloomberg is, quote, increasingly concerned that the current field of candidates is not well positioned to take down President Trump. In 2020, adding that, quote, he would be able to fight the fight to Trump and win. And, you know, Willie, people around Mayor Bloomberg said last night that he's not sure he can win this thing. There are a lot of obstacles to him winning this thing. But at the same time, with what's been happening with Ukraine, with what's been happening across the world, with what's been happening in the United States, and you have to look no further than that Louisiana rally or the Kentucky rally, he just couldn't, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines anymore.
Yeah, and we should underscore that he's not officially in the race yet. He's looking at the race. As you said, the Alabama deadline is today. So if he was going to get in, he had to make a move, get some signatures, pay the fee to get on the ballot in the state of Alabama. But we've said many times that Mayor Bloomberg is a data-driven guy. He's got a team around him who looks at the numbers. And he's always said if he didn't see a path of victory, he wouldn't waste his time and money getting into the race. He flirted with it in March, as a lot of people may remember, and then announced that he wouldn't get in, thought his resources could be better used otherwise, helping with ads and activism. So the question, I guess, is what's different now from March? What does he see now that he didn't see then? And Guy Cecil understands the Democratic Party as well as anybody. What's your read on what Bloomberg sees now sitting here in November? Is it the weakness of the field? Is it the weakness of the president? Why is today different than March was?
Well, first, I think it's telling that every time the Bloomberg folks said that they were not going to run, they cited data.
Right.
But now, in the lead up to potentially announcing that he will run, they haven't cited the data that says he can win. I think there's it's one thing to take on Donald Trump. It's another thing to take on the Democratic primary. And I think he's going to find it incredibly challenging because, especially in the early states, it's not really about the money. The fact is the candidates that are in the race now have the resources to get through the first 4 or 5 states where Bloomberg's money can make a difference is Super Tuesday and beyond. And I think he's looked at the apparent weaknesses of other candidates. Certainly, there's a lot of consternation among establishment Democrats and among big money donors around Medicare for All. I think all of this has sort of led him to the place that he's thinking about running.
So who does he affect most in this race? Obviously, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders are happy to see him in the race. He's the boogeyman that they've set up, going after billionaires every day. Does he hurt Joe Biden? Does he hurt Mayor Pete? How does this impact the race if it does at all?
I think this is where a lot of the conventional wisdom is wrong. There's a lot of focus on this one-for-one transfer of votes between Biden and the mayor. That may not necessarily be true. I think despite the fact that people have been projecting a lot onto the Biden campaign, the reality is he probably has one of the most diverse coalitions. And the question for the mayor is, can he break into that coalition? Can he appeal to African Americans in the South? Can he appeal to Latinos in California? I really think it is folks like Buttigieg and Klobuchar and Booker who are really attempting to move into that first tier of candidates. And it's easy to imagine that Bloomberg's entrance into the race makes it much more difficult for somebody at 2, 3, 5, 8% to move into that upper tier because he's simply going to own some of that vote going into the race. The more interesting question is when you self-fund, if it's only self-funding, that would preclude you from being in any presidential debates. And so the question is, what does a Mike Bloomberg fundraising strategy online look like when you're being pretty transparent about the fact that you can spend $5, 10, $20 billion running for president.
So, Guy, if the Bloomberg campaign went to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, wouldn't make a lot of sense. You've had candidates over the past year beat themselves up. I mean, a lot of them got into the race, fought like hell, and are already out, even a couple of months away from Iowa. But if the theory of Bloomberg's case is, and it just may be, I'm going to let everybody fight it out, maybe Mayor Pete wins Iowa, maybe Elizabeth Warren wins New Hampshire. South Carolina is a jump ball because Biden's the only person in the race that has significant support from older black voters, but he may not even make it to South Carolina. And then, of course, a couple of days later, it's Super Tuesday. These candidates are exhausted from that. And Mike Bloomberg has laid down $100 million in the Super Tuesday states. And that's when 40% of the delegates are up on Super Tuesday. Suddenly, you're talking about data, that doesn't seem like such a bad strategy unless, let's say, a Mayor Pete sweeps the first 4 states.
I think that's right. I mean, the telling thing from Jonathan Swan's reporting is the fact that they've made it very clear they plan on running a national campaign from day one. And the ability of Bloomberg to spread the field. I mean, they can, if you think about Super Tuesday states, first of all, you have California and Texas. So the idea that you could advertise statewide in California and Texas, organize in those states, gives you a pretty significant advantage. The weakness in that plan is if you have somebody that runs 2 or 3 of the first 4 states, develops momentum. Sometimes money can't solve that problem. I think the other question is, does Bernie Sanders, does Elizabeth Warren continue to raise money at an increased pace? Do both of them stay in the race through Super Tuesday? My assumption is yes. The other question is, are there others still thinking about getting into the race? I mean, there's been reports, obviously, of Eric Holder looking at the race. We've seen in multiple public appearances Hillary Clinton toy with the race. It's certainly possible that we're not done. It's hard to imagine me saying this out loud, with more candidates getting into this race and complicating everything.
But you know, Donnie, the problem with Eric Holder getting in, or somebody that is not worth $50 billion getting in at this late moment, because Holder would make sense for me, because again, if Biden's not a strong candidate, where is the Bill Clinton candidate that can win in South Carolina, that can win across the Deep South with older black voters who are the bedrock of these Democratic primary contests, and not just out there. So Holder would make sense, or another candidate that could appeal, a Clinton, Bill Clinton-like candidate that could appeal. But the problem for Eric Holder or any other mere mortal is 3 or 4 days after South Carolina, you've got Super Tuesday, and you've got California, you've got Texas, you've got states across the Deep South, and there's no way they can keep up with that momentum. So this, you know, your first instinct is, okay, wait, this just doesn't make any sense, because this guy's going to get killed in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. But again, as Guy said, if we have Mayor Pete or Bernie winning Iowa, Elizabeth winning New Hampshire, somebody else winning South Carolina, I mean, it's game on Super Tuesday, and Bloomberg's going to be the only person, with even Joe Biden running out of money, Bloomberg's going to be the only person that can advertise in California, in Texas, and in all these other states.
He's not going to just advertise. He will own them. I actually do think that that's the strategy. You know, if we go back a little bit when he ran in New York, he came out of nowhere and just in the New York mayoral race spent $100 million. And I don't want to say bought the election in the wrong way, because obviously people voted for him and he ended up being a fantastic mayor. But money talks. $52 billion. Let's say that again, $52 billion. He could theoretically spend $25 billion. You know, we talk about that Trump might raise $1 billion, or Elizabeth Warren raised $25 million in the last quarter, and that was kind of a big whoop. $52 billion. And I can't say that enough. Like, he could literally just take half of his fortune and spend 25x what Donald Trump spends. The other thing that he has, we keep looking for the anti-Trump. And the one thing about him that is an anti-Trump, he is the real deal of what Trump purports to be. He's probably certainly the most successful businessman in New York, one of the 5 or 10 most successful businessmen in the country. He's done it honestly. He's done it by adding value. He's been incredibly charitable. So the very, very kind of Trump is the ultimate charlatan, is the ultimate fake. He can peel that emperor's clothes off of Trump just about better than anybody. I think this is huge, huge news, and I do think he's an electable candidate.
Donnie, nothing will make President Trump more angry than seeing the graphic that shows Mike Bloomberg worth $52 trillion, according to Forbes, and he worth $3 billion. $50 billion difference there.
Everything with Trump is size, and Bloomberg has got the size where it matters to Trump.
So, Elise, let's talk about Mike Bloomberg's constituency. Who exactly is, to Guy's point, the group of Democratic voters who will move to him if he does, in fact, get in the race? We've got the progressive voters supporting Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who certainly will not have any affinity for Mike Bloomberg. Where do his votes come from?
Well, you get some of the moderate voters who are going for Joe Biden right now, and probably some of Mayor Pete's voters. But again, I think to Guy's point, can Mayor Bloomberg could he pull a diverse coalition? I think that's the big question. Given some of his policies as New York City mayor, will that be baggage that will keep him from appealing to a more diverse electorate? And you absolutely have to win over a coalition if you're going to go anywhere in this Democratic primary. And I don't know if Mayor Bloomberg can do that, but at the same time, the country seems to be hungry for someone pragmatic who is just going to get things done. And that's certainly the record that he had in New York City at the time. I thought the soda ban was a little much. Now, today, I miss him so much as mayor of New York.
So, Karine, didn't we just go through this exercise in a different way when Howard Schultz put his toe in the water? A New York-born guy with a great personal story, started a great American company, a billionaire who was going to be the pragmatic guy who knows how to make things work and run things. He got a very rude welcome when he even toyed with the idea of entering this race.
Well, I have to tell you, Willie, I'm glad that Bloomberg is considering running in a Democratic primary rather as an independent. That actually is good news, as we saw with Howard Schultz, which is what you were kind of alluding to there. Look, this is going to be an uphill battle for Bloomberg. Look, you could have all the money in the world, but doesn't mean that you have a strategy. Doesn't mean that's strategic. Look, when you look at the field, and if he does jump in, he's going to be hurting Mayor Pete. He's going to be hurting more like Amy Klobuchar, like Guy was saying. And he's not going to take votes away from Warren. He's not going to take votes away from Bernie. And earlier, Willie, you were saying back in back in March, he was thinking about running. He didn't. Well, there was a poll in Iowa that came out, and it was done by one of the best pollsters out there. And it showed that he had one of the worst favorability amongst all of the Democratic candidates. That was back in March. So I don't know if, and I remember, this is a Democratic Party. This is a Democratic base. I don't know if they're pining for another billionaire.
We shall see very soon. Of course, thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.